Teach Me to Help, Module 2, Lesson 4, Online Verbal Communication Techniques, the importance of words and how they can influence perception. Lesson Structure, Online Verbal Communication Techniques, the importance of words and how they can influence perception. 1. General notions about verbal communication, the role of speech. 2. Use of disability-inclusive language. 3. Fundamentals of inclusive verbal communication. 4. The importance of words and how terms can influence perception. 5. The power of speech and its properties in influencing behavior. 6. Language techniques that make verbal communication difficult or not. 7. Language techniques that can make verbal communication effective or so yes. Conclusions. Objectives. At the end of the lesson, learners will be able to recognize general notions about verbal communication, show the role and properties of the word, use language that is inclusive of people with disabilities, practice principles of inclusive verbal communication, choose appropriate words in communicating with people with special needs, exemplify verbal techniques that make communication difficult, so no, exemplify verbal techniques that make communication more effective, so yes, review notions of communication theory to improve their own communication. Become aware of communicative situations in which we use the properties of the word. Update favorable and unfavorable techniques useful in the communication process. 1. The role of words in the influence process. The term verbal, Latin verbum, means word and speech. Communication with words equals verbal communication. The word in vocal or audible form equals oral or spoken, and in graphic, visual expression equals written. The distinction is made by the channel of communication, auditory for oral communication and visual for written communication. Verbal communication is the exclusive prerogative of man, the only living creature capable of communicating thoughts and feelings using words in the form of vocal or graphic signs. Each language is made up of 28 to 35 phonemes, which graphically and sonically make up an alphabet. These make up words and are delimited by pauses in oral communication or by spaces in written communication. Frutianu, 2004. The essence of verbal language lies in its symbolic character based on purely conventional correspondences between the word sign, the cat for example, and the object it signifies, the meow meow animal. The meaning is not contained in the word, but in the mind of the recipient. Words are codes, not sound signals or graphic signs with meaning in themselves. Even the definition given to words in dictionaries remain dead letters if they are not decoded by readers. Tran and Stanjucelu, 2010, define communication as a fundamental mode of psychosocial interaction of people carried out in articulated language or other codes in order to convey information, achieve stability, or bring about changes in individual or group behavior. Communication peculiarities. Relationships are established between people in the same environment. Distinctly, online communication can also continue face-to-face, just as face-to-face communication can cross online. It aims to achieve objectives and convey meaning through the composition of the message conveyed. The three dimensions of all communication, outward, observable through verbal and nonverbal behavior, meta-communication, what is understood beyond words, and intra-communication, the exchange of information that takes place at the level of the inner self. The imprint of the space in which it takes place, conveying the characteristics of that environment. In particular, online communication makes use of the specific characteristics of the digital environment. The message, the people and the relationships established are dynamic once this process is initiated. It generates evolution and change, sometimes irreversible. Speaking clearly and listening carefully become the two mutual goals for communicating effectively online and face-to-face. Dale King, 2020. Bortsun, 2001, outlines the main purposes of communication: to be received, seen, heard, read; to be understood, the transmitted message to be decoded correctly; to be accepted, message sent not to be rejected; to provoke a reaction, the message conveyed to bring about a change in perception, thinking, interpretation, or behavioral attitude. The psychology of communication highlights a number of other goals that people pursue when communicating, linked to the fulfillment of specific human needs: the need for prestige, the confirmation of social status, the banishment of loneliness. Digital communication etiquette (netiquette) refers to: 1. Establish clear communication guidelines. 2. Respecting others' time and attention. 3. Promoting a positive and inclusive environment. 4. Managing conflict with diplomacy and respect. 5. Understanding and respecting privacy and boundaries. Application 1. Motto: every word is an attempt to influence the other. Alex Mukieli. An induction word is given. Examples: communication, love. Each participant in the meeting makes a list of 10 induced words that occur in the mind after the given inducer word, associated with the images and sensations suggested by it. Compare the lists of induced words, marking first the words that are repeated twice, then 3 times, and so on depending on the context of the activity. Interpret and comment on the results of the game. It can be seen that one word evokes different individual experiences, even if they are signified by the same word. Note: the application can be done both in the traditional face-to-face format and online. In a digital context, collaborative lists from apps can be used. 2. Inclusion and divisiveness through language. UN recommendations. Inclusion and divisiveness through language. Political correctness and inclusive language share the goal of using a certain, sometimes neutral, terminology to mitigate prejudice and stereotypes. However, their application has proven divisive. While some segments of society enthusiastically embrace these linguistic shifts, others resist, leading to a cultural and social polarization, often termed the culture wars. UN recommendations for a disability-inclusive language. The UN Office has developed recommendations to support the implementation of the Disability Inclusion Strategy introduced in 2019. The aim is to remove barriers and involve people with disabilities in all aspects of work and life to achieve progress in their inclusion. An important aspect of the strategy is compliance with the communication standard, which requires internal and external communications to demonstrate respect for people with disabilities. It provides guidelines for improving verbal and written communication about disability, covering various forms of communication from speeches and presentations to press releases and social media posts. The right choice of words is crucial in communicating with people with disabilities, as terminology can influence how they are perceived. Using inappropriate language can lead to exclusion or offense, affecting their participation and human rights. The use of inclusive language is essential in the fight against discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities. According to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it is essential to adhere to appropriate language and terminology. Precise guidelines are given for the correct understanding and use of this language. The main purpose of these guidelines is to promote the uniform use of appropriate language within the UN. They provide a table of preferred and non-preferred terms, together with examples for clarification, to ensure compliance with established terminology standards. 3. Guidelines for using a disability-inclusive language. Use language that prioritizes people above their illnesses or disabilities. Person-based language is the most commonly recognized form of communication for people with disabilities because it puts the focus on the person or group before the disability. However, not all categories of disability are universally prioritized, and it is important to ask about the preferred way of identifying people with disabilities. As an illustration, we can use examples such as people with albinism, pupils with dyslexia, female people with intellectual disabilities, and of course, people with disabilities. Avoid using categorizations and generalizations. Disability is an inherent aspect of human existence and should not be exaggerated or sensationalized. People with disabilities should not be portrayed as inspirational or as having extraordinary abilities. Refusal to refer to them as brave or outdated is patronizing. The term survivor is sometimes used to describe those who have successfully adapted to a medical condition, but some find the rhetoric of war inappropriate and unpleasant. Disability is neither a medical condition nor a challenge. The medical model of disability sees disability as a health condition to be corrected, while the charitable model sees it as a burden to be solved. This approach maintains unfavorable stereotypes and unfair labeling. People with disabilities should not be labeled as patients unless they are receiving medical treatment. Instead, they should be referred to as a person with dyslexia or a person who has dyslexia. People-centered terminology should be used and phrases such as a person has a disability or a person is blind, deaf may be used. The term victim should only be used when directly applicable. Use appropriate language in verbal and casual speech. Most people with disabilities can easily cope with vocabulary commonly used in everyday situations. To include a person who uses a wheelchair, you can suggest, "Let's go for a walk." Similarly, to communicate with someone who is deaf, you can ask, "Have you heard the news?" However, expressions such as blind as a bat or deaf as a post are inappropriate and should be avoided even in casual situations. Incorrect use of terms can also be inappropriate and offensive, so refrain from stating, "I think I have Alzheimer's," when you forget something, or "they're paranoid," when others seem to act with extreme distrust. Avoid using disability-related terminology or an offensive or critical phrase. Avoid using the term lame as a substitute for boring or uncool. 4. Importance of words and how terms can influence perception. Avoid passive victim words. Use language that respects disabled people as active individuals with control over their own lives. Language that includes and takes into account people with disabilities. Appropriate terms. Disabled person. Person with type of disability. People with disabilities. Person without disabilities. Rest of the population. Has, name of condition or impairment. Disabled person. Inappropriate terms. The handicapped, the disabled, person with special needs, atypical person, person with different abilities, normal, healthy, able, typical, whole to body, healthy in body, mind, afflicted by, suffers from, victim of, cripple, invalid. Language that includes and takes into account people with disabilities. Appropriate terms. Person with intellectual disabilities. Person with an intellectual disability. Person with psychosocial disability. Deaf person. Person who is deaf. Hearing impaired person. Hearing impaired person. Deaf person. Deaf blind person. Inappropriate terms. Retarded. Simple. Slow. Slowly. Affected. Brain impaired. Intellectually challenged. Subnormal. Feeble-minded. Handicapped. Crazy. Manic. Psychopathic. Hypersensitive. Lunatic. Insane. Panic. Agitated. Mental deranged. Mentally ill. Deaf, hard of hearing, deaf and dumb, deaf mute. Appropriate terms. Short person, small person, someone with restricted growth or short stature, person with achondroplasia, only if the person has this condition, person with Down syndrome, person with trisomy 21, person with albinism, person affected by leprosy, person using a communication device, person using an alternative method of communication, accessible parking, parking reversed for the disabled, accessible bathroom, inappropriate terms, dwarf, midget, mongoloid, special person, down, albino, leper, mute, unable to speak, nonverbal, disabled parking, bathroom for disabled people. Terms requiring further linguistic clarification. The distinction between access and accessibility. Access refers to the opportunity or right to participate in a particular activity or to enter a particular place. Having a United Nations badge allows you to enter the UN premises. Accessibility is the intentional design of goods, technologies, services, or places to ensure that they can be easily used by people, whether or not they have disabilities. It includes the provision of accessible information and communication. Physical accessibility refers to the creation of a barrier-free environment that enables people with disabilities to move about without restriction. Although access may be granted, it does not necessarily guarantee accessibility. It is therefore important to use these expressions appropriately and in the correct context. 2. Braille. Braille is not considered a language, but rather a tactile writing system used by blind and visually impaired people to read and write. Braille is a tactile system consisting of raised dots that can be seen tactically, used by people with impaired or limited vision. Not all visually impaired people are able to understand and interpret Braille. People who are able to read and write using Braille can be identified as Braille users. It is important to note that the ability to read Braille is not exclusive to blind people. Therefore, one should avoid making assumptions about a person's visual impairment solely on the basis of their ability to read Braille. The act of transforming written text into Braille is referred to as transcription rather than translation. The technique of creating an embossed design on a surface is known as embossing. 3. The distinction between subtitling and transcription. Subtitles and transcripts may be displayed as text at the bottom of the screen and represent speech, but they are not the same thing. Transcripts are particularly beneficial for the hearing impaired as they provide details of background sounds, speaker identification, music description, and other pertinent information. Subtitles are designed for viewers who can hear but cannot understand the language spoken in the video, such as in foreign language films. They provide speech only. There are two types of subtitles: open subtitles and closed subtitles. The viewer has the option to disable closed captions, but open captions are permanently included in the film and cannot be displayed. Accessible meetings include live transcripts, which can be provided either remotely or on location. It is important to consider all these distinctions when using these phrases. 4. Community of the deaf. The phrase "I'm deaf" is frequently used by those who pride themselves on being part of the deaf community. They perceive themselves as a distinct cultural and linguistic minority, using sign language as the predominant means of communication and possessing comparable principles. However, United Nations practice is not to capitalize the terms deaf or deaf community. 5. People who have both hearing and sight impairment. People with deaf blindness represent a diverse group of people who experience substantial sensory impairments, including both blindness and deafness. At the United Nations, the term deaf blindness is preferred. 6. Statement and vision. People with disabilities have the right to choose whether or not to disclose information about their disability status. In the workplace, it is advisable to refrain from using the conventional phrases disclosing or declaring the disability, as this may imply that the person is disclosing a confidential matter. Avoid using the phrase identification as a person with disability, as this creates concerns about identity and inclusion. It is possible for a person to have a physical or mental limitation, but not to consider themselves a person with disability. The phrases choose to share information about their disability accurately describes the decision people make to disclose their disability or specific needs to their employer or co-workers. 7. Disabled person. The term disabled person is favored in some nations. The phrase in question should be retained when discussing their laws, policies, or entities, as it accurately represents the situation in the nation or the conscious decision of the author. If deemed essential, quotation marks may be used as appropriate. It is advisable to use people first language on United Nations websites, documents, and speeches referring specifically to people as persons with disabilities. 8. Simplified readability. Easy Read is a format designed specifically for people with intellectual disabilities or those who have difficulty understanding written information. The act of creating an easy-read version of a regular publication is called adaptation rather than translation. However, like any other written material, Easy Read composed in one language has the ability to be converted into any alternative language, resulting in what we call translation. For example, the statement, "The United Nations Chronicle," is an easy-to-read quarterly report on the work of the United Nations and its agencies. does not indicate that the chronicle is specifically provided in an easy, accessible format. It means that the report is written in a simple and understandable way. 9. Help, support, assistance. The terms help, support, and assistance have distinct meanings and are not interchangeable. The use of help is discouraged because it conveys the perception that people with disabilities lack autonomy and rely on others. Support and assistance are more empowering and appropriate terminology and can be used in phrases such as participants in need of assistance or disability support measures. 10. The distinction between impairment and disability. According to the World Health Organization, impairment is defined as any deviation or abnormality in psychological, physiological, or anatomical structure or function. Disability, on the other hand, results from the interaction between persons with impairment and barriers imposed by attitudes and environmental factors which prevent their full and equal participation in society, as stated in the preamble to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, under E. Because of their distinct definitions, these words cannot be substituted for each other. 11. Comparing integration and inclusion. Integration and inclusion are very distinct from each other. Integration is the act of helping an individual to adapt and conform to society, while inclusion involves changing society to ensure that everyone, regardless of disability status, is included. When discussing people with disabilities, the implications of inclusion are favorable, but those of integration are unfavorable. Consequently, the two terms cannot be used interchangeably. 12. Distinctions between needs and requirements. Some United Nations agencies and experts have expressed a preference for using the term requirements instead of needs. This aligns with the human rights perspective on disability, in which we recognize that people with disabilities possess inherent rights. The phrase needs is often associated with the misconception that people with disabilities are dependent or burdensome, particularly when referring to their care needs. An example that exemplifies this methodology is the fact that educational institutions are obliged to provide Braille materials to visually impaired students, not because of their need, but because they are entitled to receive a high standard of education just like their peers. 13. Disability rights organizations. Organizations made up of people with disabilities should be distinguished from organizations that exist for the purpose of assisting people with disabilities. Organizations that include people with disabilities are run and managed by people with disabilities themselves. They advocate for the legal rights and interests of their members. Instead, organizations dedicated to people with disabilities provide services and advocate for their rights, but are not run or managed by people with disabilities. 14. PWD stands for People with Disabilities. The use of the acronym PWD, Person with Disabilities, to refer to persons with disabilities is not appropriate in official United Nations documents. 15. Simplified language. Plain language refers to communication that is easy for the audience to understand at first reading or hearing. Simplistic language and technical terms are omitted and some other guidelines are followed, including the use of concise sentences and refraining from the use of the passive voice. It may alternatively be referred to as plain English, simple writing, or straightforward writing. However, the situation is very pertinent. For example, if you specify that a document will be available in plain English, it could be interpreted as being exclusively in English, not including other languages. If this is not the case, it would be more desirable to use plain language. 16. Provision of reasonable accommodation. In the context of disability, the term accommodation, sometimes used in the phrase reasonable accommodation, refers to essential and appropriate modifications and adaptations made to ensure that people with disabilities can fully exercise their human rights and fundamental freedoms. To avoid any confusion, other terms such as dwelling, accommodation, place of residence, or living arrangements may also be used when talking about a place of habitation or residence. However, the term accommodation can be used if there is no ambiguity. 17. Animals trained to help people with disabilities. Service animals are thought to perform specific activities for people with disabilities. This may include animals that serve as guides for the visually impaired, animals that help to pull wheelchairs, or animals that retrieve dropped items. Occasionally, the term animal is preferred to dog, to incorporate other categories of animals that provide comparable services. For example, capuchin monkeys have been trained to help people with physical disabilities carry out their daily activities. Other creatures that can be trained or used to provide comfort are parrots, ferrets, and horses. 18. Study of sign language and international sign language. Sign languages from different regions have unique characteristics and are not mutually intelligible. Mexican Sign Language and Lithuanian Sign Language are just a few examples of sign languages. Some countries, such as Canada, have many sign languages. When discussing these particular languages, it is necessary to capitalize every word in their names. Although there is no international sign language, there is a type of communication known as international sign language. International Sign is a standardized system of signs that is used when deaf people from different countries get together on different occasions. Thus, we say that the United Nations provide interpretation of international signs, refraining from labeling them as a separate language. 19. Comparison between visual impairment and blindness. The term visual impairment or vision impairment covers a broad spectrum of vision conditions, of which blindness is only one. Therefore, these two terms are not synonymous. The power of the word is reflected in human behavior through physiological reactions determined by the direct biochemical effects a word has on the human brain, identifiable by the lie detector. In order to make a person perform a certain behavior, we need to create a certain mood, the preferred psychological state for that action. A word can make us laugh or cry unstoppably, make us dream or suffer. Pragmatic mechanisms. Labels. Label words for our emotions, passions, and feelings. Images. Words that directly signify a mental image. Association. Spontaneous meanings in a person at the influence of a word. Parallel information. Information about the speaker through the words used. Words are not reality but only a symbolic expression whose meaning is attributed to the person. The same word can arouse different moods. Denotation refers to the common meaning given to a word by members of a community, basically the dictionary definition. In the movement of language, we identify a series of correspondences that challenge the rigor of words. Synonyms. Words that differ in form but have a similar or identical meaning. Example, like, similar. Homonyms. Words with the same graphic form but totally different meanings. Example, jolly, jolly. Polysemy, the multiplicity of meanings that a word can have. Example, the verb to keep, which in Romanian has 45 meanings. Connotation is the figurative meaning attributed to a word. The expression a sharp mind does not refer to a cognitive system bound by a sharp knife, but has the connotation of depth of thought. Application 2. Illustrative Experiment. Pruteanu, 2004. A 2003 BBC study on false memories selectively activated under the covert influence of words contained in the structure of questions suggested that participants view 24 images. Among the slides presented was a picture of two cars colliding. At the end, the subjects were asked questions in different ways. Some have been asked how fast they think the cars that collided with each other were going. Others were asked how fast they thought the cars that crashed into each other were going. Although the difference between the two questions consisted only in the replacement of the verb bumped, mashed, The influence of this change resulted in a group that received the second question indicated an average of speed 45-50 kilometers higher than the group of participants asked the first question. Furthermore, the second question caused some participants to recall details such as broken windscreen shards at the crash site, which were not really there. Application 3. Using the appropriate words. A. Words of success versus words of failure. Observe the speech of a successful person. You will notice that he or she chooses words that express positive emotions and experiences, avoiding negative ones altogether. Make a list of 3 frequently used demotivating words. Try to find one softer degree of expression for each, then 2, and practice replacing them in your expression. B. Negative words. Attention to language could be as meticulous in word choice as it is in choice of dress. Prutianu 2004 provides a list of less negative words than those commonly used. Angry, agitated, satisfactory, promising, stressed, anxious, jealous, possessive, depressed, conceited, quarreling, controversy, disaster, problem, maddened, concerned. Express a personal experience using first the first word, then the second word, and notice the difference in perception. C. Positive words. We are also used to using positive, conventional words to express our feelings and experiences. This is the case with the well-known well, attributed to a very wide range of experiences. Similarly to negative expressions, Prutianu 2004 also provides a list of positive words of different levels: good, extraordinary, interesting, lightning, extraordinary, divine, normal, superb, determined, unwavering, loved, adored, etc. Express a personal experience using first the first word, then the second word, and note the difference in perception. 6. Language techniques that make a verbal communication difficult or not. George Orwell. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. Thinking in words, like the need to think in order to use and understand words, creates interdependencies between thinking and language. The pitfalls of verbal thinking: ambiguity, polarization, generalization, logoria, secretomania, egocentrism, jargon, slang, abstraction, denial, adverse, upset, indecision, impossible, disarming, tolerant, lie, conditional. Ambiguity refers to the use of words' properties to create messages with multiple unclear meanings. For example, when we say "a dozen professionals," we can equally well understand the denotative meaning, 12 people, or the connotative meaning, unimportant, insignificant, ordinary people. We can also use the word hound to mean both a dog and a policeman, goose to mean a bird or a gullible girl, etc. Polarization is the way of expressing ideas dichotomously around the two magnetic poles: positive versus negative, good or bad, black or white. without shades of gray, as common sense reveals. Between black and white, there are countless shades of gray. For example, if we say that Germans are serious or non-serious, we exclude most of the category that does not belong to one or the other of these extremes. The tendency to dispute and enter into conflict immediately arises when communicating in polarized language. The solution would be to propose opposing versions of what we want, in the form of questions such as, "Don't you think?" which might stir up the spirit of contradiction, the negative reaction that actually helps to achieve the goal. Jargon is a language in which words are used for the purpose of professional communication. Often, jargon communication can seem pretentious, elevated, pompous, which is why it is sometimes used by people to express a false professional prestige. To illustrate the jargon, Frutianu, 2004, evokes a message from the communication of some railway workers. Mammoths in front, pick up. Before, we make 500 CWT a day and sabotage as much as we can on the abutment. Only railway workers could understand. Slang is a more colorful, picturesque variety of jargon used in more suburban environments, but also cultivated in other contexts. Slang can be enjoyable, bringing a particularity to the language of young people, but it can block communication or exclude slang speakers in higher backgrounds. You wouldn't be able to communicate in a formal environment with colloquialisms, cool, lame, etc. The tolerance shouldn't highlights those rules of contact that we expose as unbreakable. But by expressing them in this formula, we still let them run their course. I shouldn't drink. Instead, I keep doing it. You shouldn't smoke. In exchange for this tolerant expression, we can emphasize firm behavior. We should never steal, kill, etc. The liar, to be honest, shows yet another trapped expression that unhappily plays on the value of honesty. When we introduce an idea with the phrase "in order to be honest," we admit that up to that point we have not been honest. But since then we decided to be. Instead of emphasizing the message introduced, attention is directed to the person of the speaker, arousing suspicion, distrust, as if his sincerity is not indubitable. The conditional "if" shows the formula needed to reach a goal. If you will do this, then you will get that. The conditional and causal nature of "if" can be vague, even suggesting an inability to do the necessary action. But replacing "if" with "when" gives a strong temporal nuance, giving the speaker the strength to achieve, confident that they have the resources they need and only need a little time. 7. Language techniques that make verbal communication effective, or so yes. Jones, 2017, presents 23 magic words that tell us exactly what we need to have influence, impact, and success in communication, based on the subconscious functions of our brain. I'm not sure if this is for you, but open-minded. What do you know about? How would you feel if? Just imagine. When would be a good time? I guess you didn't get the chance to. Simple exchanges. You have three options. Two types of people. I'm sure we're similar in this respect. If, then, don't worry. Most people. The good news is, what happens next? What makes you say that? Before you decide, if I can, will you do the same? Reach. One more thing. A favor, please. Just out of curiosity. 1. I'm not sure if this is for you, but the author suggests using magic words to present an idea or product to anyone at any time without fear of rejection. The phrase, "I'm not sure it's for you, but," increases the listener's curiosity and encourages them to make a decision. This gentle approach ensures that the decision feels pressure-free. with internal autonomy, preventing people from avoiding the opportunity to pitch their idea or product. The magic of a conversation is delivered through the last three-letter word but. The word but negates everything that has gone before, making the listener feel like they might want to explore the topic. For example, "I'm not sure it's for you, but" can be used to encourage someone to look at the results of a product or service. This can be beneficial in daily routines and conversation. 2. Open-minded. Open-minded people are more likely to be perceived as such than closed-minded ones, which can lead to a more favorable conversations. To draw people to your idea, use phrases like "How open-minded are you?" and follow it up with a scenario you want them to agree with. This approach increases the chances of them agreeing with your idea by 90%. Everyone wants to be open-minded, so use these words effectively. 3. What do you know about? In conversations that quickly turn into debates because someone thinks they know best, it is essential to control the conversation by moving the other person's position from certainty to doubt. This can be done by challenging their opinion or by engaging in an argument. Overcoming the "I know best" mentality can be challenging, especially when trying to introduce new ideas or concepts. To overcome the "I know best" mentality, question your knowledge of the other person's opinion. The goal is to turn the situation into one where the other person admits that their opinion is based on insufficient evidence, while saving face in the conversation. The power of asking, "What do you know about?" can delicately threaten their knowledge base and force them to share the reference, often leading to the realization that the firm opinion was unfounded. 5. Conclusions. In this lesson, a theoretical synthesis of general notions about verbal communication has been made, showing the role and properties of the word that give power in the process of influence in verbal communication. Numerous applications have been exhibited to illustrate and practice the concepts presented. An inclusive communication guide was presented with examples of appropriate verbal terms in communication with and about people with disabilities. The particularities of etiquette in online communications were presented. Practical aspects have been dealt with in the last two sections by detailing and exemplifying verbal techniques that make communication difficult, so no, and that make communication more effective, so yes. The content presented is a guide to perfecting verbal communication online or face-to-face by reviewing some of the concepts of communication theory specific to any language. Provides a guide to effective and appropriate communication with and about people with disabilities. Useful in becoming aware of communication situations where we use the properties of the word in the communication process. Provides guidance and etiquette in online communication. Updates favorable and unfavorable techniques useful in the influence process targeted by any communication.